Hello, everyone, and welcome to the last installment of the Ground series. I am Marcia Capdelian, Assistant Professor of Landscape Architecture and Urbanism at the School of Architecture at USC and Director of the Landscape Futures Lab. Together with Associate Professor and Director of the Landscape Architecture and Urbanism program, Alison Hirsch, we are the co-curators of this series. Before we begin today's conversation on broken grounds, I'd like to acknowledge the grounds from which some of us are speaking today. Both Alison and I are located on the ancestral grounds of the Gabrielino Tongva people, who historically inhabited the San Gabriel Valley area around present-day Pasadena and Altadena. We also acknowledge the grounds on which our institution, the University of Southern California, sits, which is the indigenous land of the Tongva people, along with the Chumash, Tataviam, Serrano, Cohia, Juaneño, and Luceño people who are associated with lands that USC also occupies around Southern California. We pay our respects to the traditional caretakers of this land, their ancestors, elders, and relations past, present, and forthcoming. It's crucial not only to acknowledge the genocide, slavery, violence, displacement, and settlement that brings us here today, but to actively address the particular harms that or colonialism and institutions who benefit from colonialism, including USC, perpetuate on indigenous lands and peoples. We recognize this land acknowledgement is limited and requires us to engage in an ongoing process of learning and accountability through action. I'd like to also recognize the team of students who have been assisting us throughout the semester on this project. And these include Jared Edgar McKnight, Hannah Michael Flynn, and Leslie Dinkin. Thank you all so much. We're also extremely grateful for the Landscape Justice Initiative and the generosity of the Grant and Shea Kirkpatrick Landscape Architecture and Urbanism Leadership Fund, which has made this series possible. Today's conversation on broken grounds is the last in the series, building on and extending beyond the themes that we've explored through the previous 6 panels. Material grounds, which focused on deep consideration of the ground's physical matter. Working grounds, which engage the embodied practice of work as it relates to the physicality of the ground. Ancestral grounds, which focused on the connection of indigenous communities to the material of the ground, including the stories and myths that it continues to tell. Archival grounds, which focused on the ground both as witness and material testimony to both human deeds and misdeeds and non-human forces. Shaky grounds, which focused on geophysical uncertainty and geopolitical instability. And the last one we had, which was othered grounds, which focused on the body and its relationship to the ground, specifically those bodies that negotiate the ground outside what have been deemed normative frameworks. All previous conversations have been recorded and are archived on our website, and we welcome you to visit should you have missed them live. And we'll be launching a call for submissions for creative work in response to the series right after the discussion today. So stay tuned for more information on how to apply after the conversation. Grounds across the group in today's conversation are deemed broken by processes of extraction, contamination, and disturbance. Rather than discrete sites of large operation natural resource extraction, the emphasis is on systems of capitalism and colonial violence as manifest in the physicality of particular places, as well as the bodies of those most exposed to toxification and cumulative risk. This culminating conversation interrogates what it means to live and die on the grounds we humans have profoundly altered. Today's conversation will be moderated by one of our own, VITTORIA de Palma, who is an associate professor of architectural history and theory in the School of Architecture here at USC. Within her robust body of work, notable for tonight, she is author of the award-winning book, Wasteland, A History, which studies early modern British conceptions of hostile territories that aims to provide a prehistory of current attitudes toward toxic and derelict post-industrial sites. By focusing on commons, swamps, mountains, and forests, the book argues that these kinds of resistant landscapes are united not by any essential physical characteristics, but rather by the aversive reactions they inspired. We're extremely grateful to have you lead our conversation today on broken grounds, VITTORIA, and the floor is now yours.
Good morning, and thank you for that introduction. I'd like to begin by thanking my colleagues, Allison Hirsch and Arusiak Gabrielian, for organizing this incredibly stimulating and thought-provoking series and for inviting me to participate. And I'd also like to thank all of our speakers for making the time to join us today. I'd like to just situate our conversation today in the context of the series that Arusiak has just mentioned. So the topics of the various conversations that we've had over the course of the semester have been united by this theme of ground. And the conversations have addressed ground as a noun in the material sense of the substance of ground, as a verb in the active sense of to ground or to situate, and as an adjective, as when something is grounded. And running through all of these conversations have been two parallel themes: ground as a site of extraction and often of exploitation, and ground as a site of resistance and creativity. And I think that our conversation today very much is looking at these parallel threads and seeing how they come into conversation with one another. So as Arusiak mentioned, these 6 other conversations that have happened so far, material grounds, working grounds, ancestral grounds, archival grounds, shaky grounds, and othered grounds, are now followed by today, the 7th and final conversation of the series, whose subject is broken grounds. And in many ways, our event today is also in dialogue with those conversations and other speakers who have come before. So I'd like to begin just by saying a few words about this general topic of broken grounds. I will then introduce today's speakers in their order of appearance. And then after the 4 speakers have given their presentations, we will have time for discussion and also for audience Q&A. So for this topic of broken grounds, the organizers have chosen speakers who have worked on grounds that are or have been sites of extraction, of disturbance, of contamination. Their work addresses the role of labor and the ways in which broken grounds can be a source of risk to bodies, to livelihoods. Now, when we think of the term broken, we often imagine an object, perhaps made of a hard substance that was once whole. The object probably used to have some kind of definite shape. It most likely also had a precise function or set of functions, but the shape and the function are no longer intact. The word broken usually has negative associations. The word may make you think of a broken machine that no longer works, or a broken bone that causes pain and inhibits bodily movement, or a broken toy that reduces a child to tears. When an object breaks, we feel almost as though it has been taken away from us, even if paradoxically, we're still holding all of its pieces in our hands. This is because something that is broken usually has both a diminished aesthetic value and a compromised use value. A broken object tends to come into this brokenness through some kind of act, often some kind of catastrophic or destructive act. In other words, broken is a state of being that exists in the after something catastrophic has happened. And in its brokenness, it also necessarily, even if inadvertently, refers to a time before, a time when it was still whole. Now, the sense of loss that accompanies an encounter with something broken sometimes spurs us to reject it, to distance ourselves from it, to relegate it to the trash heap so that it is no longer in sight or in mind. But we may also be inspired to fix it, which does not mean trying to bring it back to its earlier unbroken state, which is impossible, but to mend it. So the subject or object may still retain the scars of that catastrophic event, but the act of mending or remediating may also promote a process of healing. And we can also think of breaking as a verb. And in this active sense, to break can refer not only to destructive acts, but also to ones that are productive, creative, often social. So ground must be broken in order for seeds to be planted. Broken fragments can be recombined in new and unexpected ways to create new assemblages. Bread is broken to establish a sense of community. Although something broken cannot be magically restored to its prior unbroken state, we may find that its new, underdetermined imperfection can allow for novel and more imaginative connections and bonds to be formed. The 4 talks today address the topic of broken grounds from different perspectives. focusing on different sites of extraction and contamination, and doing really important work in uncovering histories that have often been obscured. Our first speaker, CARA DESPAIN, is an artist working in film and video, sculpture, photography, and installation, addressing issues of land use and ownership, climate change, visualizing the Anthropocene, and toxic frontierism. She was born in Salt Lake City, Utah, and currently lives in Miami, Florida, and works between the two. She has received numerous awards and grants, including the South Florida Consortium Fellowship, and this year was a finalist for the Creative Capital Award. She just completed a public art commission with Miami-Dade County, and her work is included in the Rubel, Shoal, and State of Utah and Salt Lake County art collections. Recent exhibitions include From Dust at the Southern Utah Museum of Art and Fractured Landscapes at the Hollywood Arts and Culture Center here in LA. Next is DEVERA SAXTON, PhD, an associate professor in the Anthropology department at California State University, Fresno. She recently published a book, The Devil's Fruit, Farm Workers' Health and Environmental Justice with Rutgers University Press. I believe it's really just hot off the press. Her current research explores the lived and embodied experiences of aging in place for elder immigrant farm workers in California's San Joaquin Valley. She is also a Senior Atlantic Fellow for Equity in Brain Health with the Global Brain Health Institute. Our third speaker, Dr. SHOURIDEH MOLAVI, is the lead Israel-Palestine researcher for forensic architecture, linking their investigations to the work and research of civil society groups and human rights defenders in the country. She has 18 years of academic, legal research, and fieldwork experience in the country on topics of state violence and human and minority rights. SHOURIDEH is also senior lecturer in critical urbanisms at the University of Basel in Switzerland. And finally, we will hear from KATHRYN YUSOFF, who is professor of Inhuman Geography in the School of Geography at Queen Mary, University of London. Most recently, she is author of A Billion Black Anthropocenes, or None, from University of Minnesota Press, which was published in 2018, a special issue on geosocial formations and the Anthropocene with Nigel Clark in Theory, Culture, and Society, Epochal Aesthetics in Efflux, and Geologic Life in Human Intimacies and the Geophysics of Race, forthcoming. Her talk today, Colonialism Now, an Effective Infrastructure of Geology, will address some of the connections between broken grounds and colonial surfaces via the mine. Please join me in welcoming today's speakers, and please submit questions you'd like to pose to either an individual speaker or to the panel as a whole in the Q&A. So first, I would like to welcome CARA, if you could just share your screen.
Sorry, 1 second. Let me just make sure everything's under control in here. Okay, great. Hello, everyone out there in the ether. And thank you so much for having me. It's really an honor. So I'm going to start with just talking about how I arrived at the research that I've currently been working on. And I'm kind of focused on nuclearism right now and the legacy of nuclearism. So I'm originally from Utah, and my mom's side of the family are downwinders. They originate in the southern Utah area, about 150 miles east of the Nevada test site. And so I've been working through depictions of romantic landscape and scale and the problems of that for some time, but I got deeper into the nuclearism aspect of that a little more recently. So don't be scared about the amount of my slides. I'm going to kind of cruise through them, but I just want to create a background for you so that when I talk about the work, there's a framework for it. So we all know where the romance with landscape starts. It was a way to create propaganda. It was also very much a building block of culture and American visual culture, but I think that that's legible the world over. So, as soon as cinema enters the game, from leaving from paintings and going to cinema, you have a whole new character and disposition that's cultivated. And, it's sort of ad nauseum, and it creates this myth that really this myth about the West, the Western US, the global frontier, the US Western frontier, and that really didn't exist ever and not for long, and is wrought with colonial violence and garbage. And it's interesting how persistent that has been. It's also interesting what is beyond the fourth wall when we're talking about a place like Monument Valley or other iconic Western landscapes. There are people there, there are extant tribes there, there are other stories of broken ground and horrible extraction and activities, you know, that are existing in those same places. And I think that we choose the shiny and beautiful history often, and stories and images and pictures, and we might forget what the realities are. So Monument Valley, where John Ford shot a lot of Westerns, many of which are iconic and heralded, but also a bit unbearable. There was a lot of uranium mining going on since that time, since the beginning in the kind of early 50s. And that's still an issue today with contamination. Just in the Monument Valley and the Dinétah, the Navajo Nation alone, there are over 1,000 abandoned uranium mines. Many of those haven't been remediated. It's a big reason that drinking water is still contaminated. And these are not the types of things, in addition to just sustained violence and poverty, that you think of when you're watching a John Ford film. So I wanted to kind of uncover some of that. And if you peel back another layer with where uranium is concerned, when we were trying to develop the nuclear arsenal during the Cold War, there was a uranium boom that existed and was very pervasive in the entire Colorado Plateau. What I think is interesting about that, and where it meets up with the sort of American culture and the Western idea of this, you know, go out and get your resources and go out and find these crazy places in the frontier. It's interesting to me that even uranium, which was very difficult to find, dangerous to extract, terrible for your health in the mining process, became like kind of Americanized. There was all these magazines coming out with how to prospect on your own, and people were buying Geiger counters. You had everybody from like working class ranchers to wealthy East Coasters coming with helicopters to look for uranium. And the federal government was sponsoring all of this. And the Colorado Plateau just got kind of torn apart. But I would say that the worst and the most lasting effects still remain on the Navajo Nation, but that's not to ignore some of the other unremediated sites in other places. It also connects back to the actual actors in the films. John Wayne, this is him here with his kids in Snow Canyon, Utah, on the set of The Conqueror, which was a Howard Hughes film where he played Genghis Khan, which is pretty crazy. And about half of that cast and crew ended up with cancer because they were shooting following one of the dirtiest atomic tests from the Nevada test site called Dirty Harry. So he's here with a Geiger counter measuring radiation. And they were actually, you know, throwing some of the hot dirt in the actors' faces. They even took some back to LA when they did reshoots and threw it in their faces some more. And this was stuff that was irradiated. And, you know, several dozens of the cast and crew actually ended up with cancers and died years later. You know, a direct correlation can't be made, but it's kind of statistically absolutely doesn't make sense. And John Wayne himself was killed. So by the time you get to that region and you think about all the different things that are beyond that fourth wall, it gets pretty wild. So, you know, 1945, when the first atomic test happened, this is the Trinity test, everything changed forever. Since that moment, there are different radioisotopes on Earth that weren't here before. In every single living thing, there are particles that weren't here before. And we also opened up a culture, a way of militarism that just can't be put back in the bottle. And, you know, the land bears the scars of that, and the culture bears the scars of that. So this is the Atomic Energy Commission film they made called Duck and Cover. There might be some people out there that remember watching this in school, probably in the 50s and 60s. This is a Nevada test site. So I started thinking about the idea of you know, romance and scale. In my other work, I kind of have grappled with and tried to tackle the impossibility of conveying scale, but also what that scale means as a perception and as an experience. And recently I'm like, but what about the granular scale? What about the tiny invisible stuff that actually persists and contaminates and harms indefinitely? And how do you convey the scale of that? Because actually that's further reaching than anything that's more visible. You know, you can see these craters from space, from satellite imagery. There are open pit mines that you can see from satellite imagery. But what you'll never see is radioisotopes. You'll never see what happened to people's bodies as a result of fallout, iodine-131 or cesium. So that started to get interesting to me in a different way. This is the Nevada test site from satellite. And at the time where they were testing atmospherically, 1951 to 1962 at the Nevada site, there were other test sites all over the world as well. People were encouraged, in fact, to go and watch the testing take place, which is pretty wild. And like the other things, the uranium rush, there became an appeal to a certain type of patriotism and a certain type of faithful person. And with the wastelanding element of choosing the Nevada test site, which is on native land, like everything that has been just decimated. There was also this population in southern Utah that were thought to be, and were, you know, kind of faithful, patriotic Mormons who were seen as compliant and obedient. And there was a direct appeal to that for them to be okay with testing. And as part of that, they and others, you know, people in Las Vegas too, were encouraged to go and watch these tests. And meanwhile, the fallout is kind of raining down on them. It found its way to culture in a way that I find pretty fascinating and actually quite disturbing. So people did film these tests. A lot of that work was classified for many decades. And I'm going to show you a piece that's using some of that footage in a little bit. But, you know, these films exist on film. And a lot of those people also became ill and died. So, you know, but the spectacle of the testing is one thing. And to invite people to watch it is one thing. Again, the consequences and the more granular stuff is quite another. So these are fallout burns on local livestock. This comes from the University of Utah Downwinder Archive. So then, you know, the Cold War presses on, and the space race comes into it, and the space race becomes this aspirational cover for our weapons development programs. A lot of ex-Nazi scientists were pulled into the States to develop missiles and rockets. I think they probably truly did want to go to space, but we were developing those very much for nuclear warheads. So you've got this weird political and sort of science fiction blend of culture emerging at this time that I think folded into our existing notions of land and landscape and the frontier in this really weird way. We sort of set our sights to space and looked at that other frontier. And there's a quote, I'm bad at this, so I'm going to forget who said it, but he who controls the space controls the universe, or something like that. I'm terrible at memorizing quotes, but that was the idea at that time, to get to the moon, to have a military base. We made it look like it was this friendly effort of all of humanity, but that is what it was. It was the arms race. So I'm, you know, kind of digging into that as a continuation of my interest in US frontierism, because I do feel like there's a global corollary there, big time. You know, the first image of the Earth taken from space from a V2 rocket that was launched from New Mexico, and then the later one, this was from the Apollo mission. There was a moment where everyone paused in 1968, I think the photo was, and said, look at all of us there. We're all in this thing, we're all stuck on this thing, we're all doing this thing together. And that was sort of the beginning of the environmental movement. And this image meant a lot to us, but what have we sort of done now? And we're still very much in a space race, by the way. We're still very much vying to control the space between the moon and the Earth and beyond Mars now is the next thing. So kind of how I pulled that all together, I'll talk mostly about 2 recent exhibitions just quickly, thinking about where those things collide and the triangulation that exists between all of them. And thinking about sort of like that 4th wall and what is a backdrop for our stories, and then what belies that and what the ugly sort of underbelly is. And I used a lot of technology, actually. This is Fractured Landscapes at the Hollywood Center in Hollywood, Florida. And, you know, satellite technology came out of the space race. A lot of these different imaging, a lot of this stuff was as we were trying to figure out how to spy on each other or sort of blow each other up. So I made these topographies using satellite imagery and a plugin that allowed me to make 3D files. And I created an installation of 16 sites that are Soviet and US nuclear test sites, Soviet and US uranium mines through the era of the Cold War, a couple of moonscapes, and you know, some of which you can see craters and scars, some of which you can't. These are the list of them if anyone is interested in that. But just sort of trying to visualize and make these sites that you either cannot visit or you would not visit, raise back to the top of our consciousness. Because truly, even though bombs many times larger were tested at the Nevada test site, for example, than that were dropped on Japan, that history still hides. And people that were affected, downwinders and uranium miners on Navajo Nation, are still hidden and buried in those in this other larger history of the Cold War and so forth. And we're still on the edge of a nuclear disaster. We're always on the edge of it. We're always on the precipice. So this is another exhibition from Dust that was at the Southern Utah Museum of Art earlier this year. And this is a 4-foot by 4-foot topography of the Nevada test site that I cast using that same method. This one you can kind of see the craters a bit easier. And I put some bright film lights behind it. This just gives you an idea of the process. So going through, I've spent a lot of time on Google Earth and Google Maps deep in there. And you know, you create a 3D file. It's as good as the imagery that you get, so it takes a lot of manipulation. And then I cut them on a CNC router out of foam, made a mold, and cast those. So this is a 16 by 9 backdrop, a photo I took of Monument Valley. Again, just thinking about the stories that belie what we see. And this is a video I made where this is an iconic last scene of John Ford's The Searchers, shot in Monument Valley. This is was John Wayne standing in the doorway, and I removed him to get rid of the iconic front man and the rugged individual to ruminate on these stories in the back. I'll play just a couple seconds of that. Also in both of these exhibitions, I made a vinyl record of oral histories and living memory of both atomic testing, people that were living in the area at the time and remember seeing the tests or were affected by illnesses. And on the other side are stories from Navajo Nation, living memories of mining and the after effects of that.
We saw the flash of light.
I'm gonna move on. This is the last thing I'll show you. This is a very hot off the press video using some of that archival footage that was declassified from atomic tests at the Nevada site. And it's set to a Mormon hymn. And I was kind of thinking of them as Rorschach tests, you know, kind of using that idea of romance and beauty and scale as a cover, aspiration as a cover for very dark psychological traumas that concern land.
As I have loved you, love one another. This new commandment, love one another.
Yeah, I think that's plenty from me. Thank you so much.
Vittoria, you're muted.
So thank you so much, Cara. If we could just now move to our next speaker, DEVERA.
Thank you, Vittoria. My name is DEVERA SAXTON, and I'm reporting to you from the San Joaquin Valley, the ancestral lands and current lands of the Yokut and Mono people. And let me get my screen share going. Also, well, actually, before I do that, I'm going to put in the chat a link of where you can, a coupon for my book. Let me grab that. So if you go to Rutgers University Press site, then you can put in that coupon code and get, I think it's 30% off if you're interested in the book. And the book covers what's behind me. The photograph is by a friend of mine, farm worker friend of mine, Amadeo Sumano, of Oxnard, and he did a lot of the photography featured in the book, including on the cover and including this image of a woman tearing up plastic tarps in a strawberry field in Oxnard, which is just north of Los Angeles, about an hour. My talk today is called Strawberry Fields as Harm Industry, Grounded Research Activism with California Farm Workers. So one of the things that I do in The Devil's Fruit, Farm Workers' Health and Environmental Justice, which is the title of my book, is I focus on myth busting a bit. And I did my research between 2010 and 2013, although parts of it bleed into my time as a faculty member in the Central Valley in at Fresno State from 2014 to the present. But the Central Coast area, the Monterey Bay area, where the Pájaro and Salinas valleys are, is, I don't know if you can see my arrow moving over the screen, but it's this chunk right here. And then Fresno is over here. So it's about 3 hours apart. The reason for the coloring on the map has to do with the levels of pesticides applied per acre. And so you can see that the Salinas Valley, which is right here, right here is Oxnard, right above Los Angeles, right here is San Luis Obispo and Santa Barbara counties. Down here is the Imperial Valley, which is also a significant agricultural producing region. And then this big chunk in the middle is the Central Valley. And then we call the part from the San Joaquin River down to Kern, the San Joaquin Valley. So this map represents pounds per acre applied, but it's easy to distance ourselves from that knowledge, that grounded on the ground knowledge and experience when we're told that helping people on the planet can be accomplished through buying stuff and buying stuff differently. And so one of the myths I grappled with when I started my research and that I was interested in as someone who came out of the fair trade movement and anti-globalization movements in my 20s, was the idea that organic agriculture would be inherently better for farm workers because at least they're not exposed to pesticides. And so this is a sign that I took at the Whole Foods in Fresno, city of Fresno. It makes me very angry because farm workers can't escape pesticide exposure even if they are working on organic farms, and oftentimes they don't get to choose where they work because they work for farm labor contractors. Other myths I came across had to do with the fact that life in California and narratives about immigration and migration, that farm workers had it much better here than they did in Mexico, that Cesar Chavez and the farm workers movement had taken care of all of the labor violations that had been experienced prior to the farm worker movement of the 60s and 70s. And that farm workers, immigrant farm workers in particular, undocumented people, were a net drain on the land through their water consumption and through their consumption of social safety net resources. And through the narratives of farm workers that I collected during my research from 2010 to 2013, their lived and embodied experiences conflicted with these more popular dominant narratives. So I like to juxtapose a lot of their stories with the environmental health science that we have, but that is often hidden from us, also through narratives about the importance of agriculture, particularly California agriculture, myths about feeding the world, about our jobs depending on agriculture. There's bumper stickers and billboards all over the place around here. Another big one that'll probably have a renaissance is no water, no jobs, because we're about to go into another drought. And so when I first moved here in 2014, those were in our faces all the time. But farm workers here, while they harvest a lot of food that gets exported all over the world, as far away as Japan and the United Arab Emirates, where Driscoll's brand strawberries, for example, are consumed. We often, the people who live here and work the land don't necessarily get to have equitable access to food or water, even though industrial agriculture is very dependent on water. It is also creating water scarcity for farm worker communities throughout the valley. And so this is why these are some of the many reasons I frame the strawberry industry as a harm industry, because there's also discourses about the inherent benevolence of industrial agriculture in this state and in this nation too. And there's many corporate social responsibility initiatives and philanthropic initiatives. Now USC and Fresno State share this in common, that we are both funded in part by one of the largest agro conglomerates. The wonderful company is funding a climate center at USC, I believe, and they just funded our student union and a community service initiative. We have to be mindful about what it means when large agro-industrial corporations are complicit in the very things that they say that they are supportive of, like youth education, upward mobility, and environmentalism, when they're actually very, very much the lead of the extractivism of agriculture. And so this is why strawberries and other forms of industrial agriculture in California and elsewhere are a harm industry in my argument. When I first arrived to Watsonville in the Pajaro and Salinas valleys, which is a major strawberry producing region, but they also produce caneberries, which is blackberries, raspberries, blueberries increasingly, because they're good money makers. I was asked by young people, the children and grandchildren of farm workers, to support their effort in a campaign to challenge the pending, at the time, the state was considering approving a very toxic soil fumigant, methyl iodide, which was set to replace methyl bromide, another soil fumigant. And soil fumigants are a specific kind of pesticide that is injected into the ground with these spaceship-like machines in order to sterilize the soil and prepare the grounds, the fields, to have clean, sterile soil so that strawberries and other transplants, so little baby plants that you put in the ground that eventually, with lots of chemical inputs and other pesticides applied on top, will become big bushy strawberry plants that produce these giant tasteless berries that get shipped all over the world and that are harvested with immigrant labor that is also extracted from people's agricultural homelands in Mexico and Central America and in other parts of the country, the Caribbean. So with the soil fumigants, they are part of a massive industry where resulting in 6 billion pounds applied globally, as many countries have embraced US-style industrial agricultural production to increase their exports and to create jobs and improve their GDP, which has very little relationship to human welfare and food security or certainly not food sovereignty on the ground. In the United States, we represent about 1/6 of that, 1 billion pounds. And in California, it's 209 million pounds as of 2016. I doubt it's changed significantly. And even if it has, even though the California Department of Pesticide Regulation and the US Environmental Protection Agency often do claim that levels of pounds of pesticides have applied have gone down, but that ignores this geographic distribution that I showed you before. And so these represent concentrated zones of agro extraction and contamination, not just of the land and the water and the air, but we as human beings who live in this, and particularly farm worker communities, embody that in very specific ways that I'll talk about in a bit. So there's all these ways that these casualties of agro-industrialism and the harms it causes are covered up by the way that data is framed, by the way that data is produced and collected by our government and agencies, but also by corporations, including those that are producing soil fumigants. So of the 209 million pounds of pesticides applied in California, about 40 million are soil fumigants, and they are particularly toxic to many of our bodily systems, reproductive health, respiratory health. And what really got me interested was neurological health, because a lot of the anti-pesticide activism in California, particularly in farm worker communities, is driven by concerns about children's health and development. But I am also interested in the life course in terms of how living in these toxic places on these toxic grounds affect people as they age. What is it like to age in these places? And so that's where my research is going. And I met people who did suffer from neurological injuries and diseases. The other thing about, about this is that you can't just go to work and come home and be safe, because people often live and go to school and play near these fields. And so the grounds of work, play, school, and home life are blurred, and as are the exposures. And that also makes it harder to keep track of what exactly people are being exposed to and how much, because even though there might be laws, at least in California, that say they're supposed to keep track of what's being applied and when, and reporting possible exposures, if people go home, there isn't an easy mechanism to do that. People are told to just call the sheriff's department or the police. And we know that when that happens, people have a very contentious and distrustful, reasonably so, justifiably so, relationship with law enforcement, particularly in immigrant communities in this region. So it creates these vacuums, but at the same time, ethnography, and I'm a medical and environmental anthropologist, so I spend a lot of time, or have spent a lot of time pre-pandemic, listening to people's stories in their households, bearing witness to these exposures and their aftermaths. They have different ways of keeping count. And so one of the most striking cases from my book and what has inspired my current research about elder farm workers was Gerardo. And I think his story also tells a story about intergenerational exposures and transnational exposures. So Gerardo was born in the 1950s and one of several brothers and sisters in rural Jalisco, Mexico, which is in central western Mexico. And in the 1950s, his father was encouraged to take on Green Revolution style corn production. So the Mexican government at the time was sending a lot of agents to these villages and encouraging farmers, small farmers, to shift their production away from milpa style, which was kind of three sisters, corn, bean, and squash, not chemically intensive, crop rotation, what people had been doing for thousands of years throughout the Americas, and to instead buy hybrid seed and to buy fertilizer and pesticide to boost production so that they could sell more of their corn. So Gerardo's father and Gerardo's brother is Luz, and Luz is how I met Gerardo, made this transition, but then died before his 60th birthday. And there's data, very old data from the United Farm Workers Union that the average life expectancy of farm workers is 49 years old. This has not been updated, but it wouldn't surprise me if that hadn't shifted significantly over time because of people like Gerardo, who I met. So their father's death instigated the migration of the brothers to the United States, to California, to the Pájaro and Salinas valleys to work in the fields. And Gerardo, in the early 1980s, was working on a crew pulling hose, which was, they don't do this so much anymore here, but you used to apply the pesticides manually with a hose and not with the protective gear that the guys in the picture are wearing. And he got very sick from this. He got home and woke up the next day and couldn't move. He was sort of temporarily paralyzed, and he informed his supervisor, and the supervisor said, well, then if you can't come back today, then you're not coming back at all. So for the next 30 years, Gerardo continued to work in the strawberries, but also his neurological health continued to deteriorate, and he would go back and forth between here and Mexico, trying to find clinicians, trying to find alternative remedies, also resorting to alcohol to help him palliate this suffering. And it wasn't until he qualified for Medicare or Medi-Cal in his 60s that he was properly diagnosed with Parkinson's disease. So he had been suffering from the preclinical symptoms and perhaps clinical symptoms of this very debilitating disease with no proper treatment and care, and then finally gets it when it's basically too late to intervene. He's not the only one. This is a very common narrative. So what do we do? Part of my book is also about the groundwork of accompanying farm workers, not just through collecting their stories, but responding through participatory reaction and using research, blurring the lines between research and activism. So another way that that farm workers keep count is through the memorials they create of people who have passed away in the fields. And then I will also I know I'm running over, but I will also say that COVID has added yet another toxic layer to the grounded realities of farm workers. And so some of the work we've been doing recently is with the COVID-19 farm worker study with the California Institute for Rural Studies. And also through my Atlantic Fellowship, I got a grant to do mask making, creating little workshops of immigrant and refugee seamstresses to create masks to distribute to farm workers. And this is an image from Centro Binacional for Oaxacan Indigenous Development, distributing masks and census and know your rights information. So it's the work on the ground is endless. Even as we are dealing with broken grounds and a broken state that is non-functional despite touting itself as a champion of workers' rights here in California. So I want to thank you all for this opportunity, and please don't hesitate to get in touch if you want to know more or want a book talk or anything like that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you also for sharing that coupon with us. So our next speaker is SHOURIDEH MOLAVI. Thank you.
Thank you for having me, for having this conversation. So the part of the world that I work in is Palestine, as you heard, and right now Palestine is undergoing ferocious attacks and multifaceted violence by the Israeli occupation forces. So the tone of my voice will probably be frustrated and angry, and it's because I am, given that all of my colleagues and friends have been displaced in Gaza at the moment, and are sort of hurriedly sending me images and photos of their destroyed environments. And so my talk is meant to be on Gaza and on Israeli coloniality in the form of environmental warfare. And so what I want to do is that I want to show you what I was going to talk about, right? What the situation was like. And then I want to bring you to the present, because I don't think I can talk about Gaza without addressing the present colonial bombardment of the Strip, the ethnic cleansing in Jerusalem and Sheikh Jarrah, and the proto-fascist attacks in 48 Palestine against Palestinian citizens. So I'm just going to share my screen, and hopefully you can all see the slide. All right, so I'm going to take you first to the eastern border of Gaza, and I don't see anyone right now, so if I'm going over, please just jump in and tell me. The eastern border of Gaza, what I call it a border, but it's not a border, it's a perimeter of Gaza. It's the longest perimeter that Gaza has with 48 Palestine or Israel proper. And it was a subject of my interest. In fact, I started asking this question 5 years ago around the disappearing trees in Gaza, that increasingly we are seeing an absence of trees in Gaza, a place that since recorded time has been known for its orange and olive, grapefruit, and pomegranate trees. And that question brought me to the border, where historically these orchards were located, and which then brought me to the question of, well, how has this border been produced over time and space? And so the footage that you're looking at is footage not during wartime or active operations time. This is on a regular Tuesday or Wednesday of the week, say, where you have Israeli occupation forces flattening, bulldozing, plummeting the Gazan side of this eastern perimeter. This is all territory that used to be composed of trees. So orchards that connected Gaza to the rest of Palestine, that went up from Gaza to Ashkelon and up to Jaffa. So the Jaffa oranges that we all know, actually they were part of one big forest, one big orchard that connected Gaza to the rest of Palestine. And so the kind of warfare that we're seeing is a farm warfare, where Israel is regularly flattening this area for its declared military objective of ensuring visibility. And so you know you're on the Gazan side because you don't have trees. And the moment you see trees, like these women are seeing trees, the moment you're at the back, you see trees, you know that that's where Israel proper starts. And so these women here, these civilians, are standing 300 meters from the border zone, which is a high-risk area. This is also the area that is the future architecture of Gaza. Gaza is 360 kilometers squared, has around 2 million people living in it. It's one of the most densely populated areas, only because it has been engineered as such. And with every war and incursion, like the one we're seeing today, this buffer zone that they are facing, what's called a buffer zone, keeps increasing. It went from 50 meters to 150 meters. And then since the last war, it has gone up to 300 meters. So standing here puts you at risk of being shot. Even if you're a farmer, you need a permit to stand there. Even with a permit, you're at the risk of getting shot at. But it is also precious territory, because it's territory that allows for agricultural growth and the development of crops, which for a small strip that is living under siege is precious territory, right? Because Israel controls, of course, the imports and the exports. And so these women, these are two women Bedouin farmers that I work with. In fact, most of the farmers in this area are Bedouin, and they are largely led by women's associations in Gaza. They're looking at a landscape, right? A landscape far away that used to be the landscape of Gaza. Gaza was known for its orchards. And if you go to any of the colonial archives in London, in Geneva, or in Jerusalem, you will see maps that were drawn of exactly those trees. But if you walk the streets of Gaza today, it's as if you are in any refugee camp in the West Bank, Jerusalem, or the Arab states. Refugee camps are not known for having trees. And in the city of Gaza, in the city of Jabalia and Khan Yunis, and these sort of major city areas in the Gaza Strip, you don't really see trees. You don't see orchards anymore. And this has a lot to do with the colonial present of Gaza, because of the absence of water, clean water for trees, because trees need non-salty water, because of time, of course, because every 2 years you have a good harvest, because of space. Trees need space. They need to be planted far away from each other, otherwise the roots eat each other. And Gaza does not have that space. And finally, because of visibility, because anything over 1 meter long, exactly on this border area, is either bulldozed or bombed by Israel. So if a farmer decides to plant a tree that goes over 1 meter, like any orange or olive or pomegranate tree would, they risk having their farms bombed. And so this is the community that I've been working with for the past 5 years. If you walk the streets of Gaza, however, what you see are graffiti like this. Graffiti that tell you the story of oranges, right? A landscape that isn't familiar to the young people in Gaza, but a landscape that was familiar to the villages that the majority of the population of Gaza came from, because you have a large majority of refugees in Gaza, and would be familiar with in that regard. So you see oranges and you see olives, also mixed with symbols of resistance. So the trees that you find in Gaza are in the form of graffiti, or in the form of a visual history, or in the form of an oral history also. And they're represented as such, but they're not physically present. So what we're seeing is that each year trees are disappearing. And this was the question that I sort of started with, because I wanted to understand why they were disappearing, which brought me to the border. And in bringing me to the border, I was sort of, the question that was put ahead of me was, well, if the orange is disappearing and the olive is disappearing, what is going to replace that identity? What is going to replace those stories and that cuisine and that history? And what I realized is that it was a mix of different factors and systems of oppression that were going to produce that. Of course, one is the ongoing Israeli settler colonial project that prevents Gazans from growing these crops. The other is a neoliberal system that makes oranges less economically conducive for growth. And the third is environmental change, which is affecting the things that can be grown inside of Gaza. And so while the people, the young generation in Gaza, do not have memories of growing up in orchards, one way of preserving this memory in the face of an older generation that we're soon losing, given that it's been 70 years since the Palestinian Nakba, one way of preserving that memory would be to look at the land. And so what I've started doing with Palestinian farmers is examining the memory of the land, what the land would remember, what the land would provide as a kind of testimony. And so one of the things I did at the beginning was collect satellite images from 1984 until 2018. And I picked the greenest day in each month. I placed them on top of each other per year for 30 years. And I created this type of visualization to slowly show how the earth and the terrain in Gaza is changing. And what you see is that with each year, the trees are dying and the border by the end of it becomes very visible. And we're talking about from space here. So the border of Gaza, this artificially produced slow violence colonial border is now visible from space. If I zoom in to the part of Gaza, the northeastern part of Gaza called Beit Hanun, which has historically been known for its orchards. Beit Hanun's orange trees are a story even inside of Gaza. So if I zoom into this area and I go a little bit faster, what you see is that the trees are slowly dying. The border is becoming more and more defined. You see that the density of the population is increasing. You see extreme urbanization. What you see is the building of bypass roads, military roads in this way that cut into the earth. And eventually you arrive in a situation where you have scorched, burnt earth, land that it has been the product of changes in cultivation, repeated bombings and missiles, and exactly that bulldozing that you saw at the beginning that happens on a daily basis. So whereas we started with an image like this with green in 1984, we end with an image like this of brown earth. And so that's one way of realizing the extent of the violence against the land, and by extension, the population of Palestinians in Gaza. Another way is to use NDVI, so remote sensing satellites. And here I basically ask the satellite to tell me what has changed in the greenness of the earth, in the vegetation of the earth that I'm sort of mapping per year for 30 years. And I tell it to plot for me in pink the areas that are experiencing stress. And by stress, we mean, salty water, forced changes in cultivation, overuse, missiles, overuse of pesticides and herbicides, all of these things, and where things were green at one point and aren't anymore. So that's the pink area. The yellow to green areas are the areas that are sort of within that range, and the blue areas are the areas that are healthy. And so when I ask the satellite to show me this per year, each year for 30 years, this is the image that comes. And what you see is exactly that area that I had shown you that had historically the green is the area where the land remembers its trauma. It remembers that there was once something green here that no longer exists. And so when I take this map and I go town by town, farm by farm along the border, as I've done in the past 5 years with farmers, and I tell them, do you remember an attack, or do you remember a loss of crops between these years? And they say no. And then I show them what the land remembers. It brings back their memory as well. And so with this, we've been able to plot a number of the destroyed lands and territories that we hadn't noticed before. But this type of map also tells me the story of settler colonialism, because if I plot the areas where the Jewish settlements were in Gaza before 2005, after which they were destroyed, you see that the Jewish settlements are located in the healthy parts of Gaza. So the areas where you had Jewish citizens of Israel living were areas that had access to clean water, that were not overused, that had not experienced significant change. And the areas where Palestinian Arabs were living were the areas that were experiencing the opposite. So this type of mapping can tell you the story of settler colonialism, of apartheid, and by extension, the history of Gaza. Now, since 2014, Israel has engaged in another practice, and this is the practice of using herbicides. So what it does is that it flies a civilian plane from a civilian company, and with the help of an agronomist, the Ministry of Defense in Israel begins to spray 3 herbicides, oxyfluorophane, diuron, and glyphosate, or in other words, Roundup. It's been doing this since 2014, and in 2015, in fact, the WHO declared glyphosate as carcinogenic. Now, what Israel does here is that it sprays it only on the border. It mobilizes the sovereignty of the border. It does not spray inside of the Gaza Strip. What you'll notice is this smoke plume, because part of the practice, in fact, and this tells you about the sort of the extreme violence of this colonial practice, part of the practice is burning a tire. So they set a plastic tire on fire. They see which direction the wind goes. If the wind goes into Gaza, the agronomist instructs them not to spray, and they don't. Sorry, if it goes away from Gaza, if it goes into Israel, they don't. If the wind goes inside of Gaza, the plane sprays, but only on the border itself, and it waits for the wind to carry it in. So when I do a freedom of information request, the army tells me we are only spraying on the border, which is true, but they spray on days that are windy and in moments when the wind is going inside of Gaza. So they mobilize environmental elements, environmental energy to destroy land inside of Gaza and to push forward this settler colonial erasure. And I'm just going to play for you this day when we were filming that we were able to catch. I don't know if you can hear it. You get a sense of how windy it was. And so a spray like this, when you spray in this way on a windy day, you cannot predict where that poison is going to land. You cannot predict how much of it will be carried and to what extent. And so when I model this in time and space, when I look at the angles of the plane vis-a-vis the direction of the wind, when I put it on top of a topography, and I look at how big the nozzles of the spray of that model of a plane are, and I put all of those things together and I give it to a forensic dynamics expert, he is then able to tell me how far into Gaza these sprays go, so that if you spray, you can see how far it goes. And eventually you have something like this, where you see that the pink parts are the parts that are highly concentrated. And what I found was that up to 350 meters into Gaza, we have higher concentration than recommended of these extremely poisonous toxic chemicals, which are destroying farmlands. When I place that on top of an NDVI, I see that they line up. And when I go farmer to farmer, land plot by land plot, and I speak to farmers, they report exactly the same thing. So it's essentially what I do is that I collect layers of evidence to tell a story. And where the farmers' memories do not catch up, the memory of the land reminds them. Now, it's not always only the case in Palestine that the state acts and people respond. What we see is that a response to the new reality in Palestine, new environmental reality, is new modes of resistance. And so in 2018, we saw thousands of Palestinians marching to the border on the east in Gaza, a civilian protest, as was called by the UN, as part of their declaration of their right of return. And they set these tires on fire to impede the visibility of Israeli snipers to shoot them, because of course, those trees were cut so that they would have visibility to shoot civilians. But they set tires on fire so that they cannot be made visible. And they march, not because it's romantic, but because they can see their villages. Most of them are from villages that are very close when they were displaced in 1948 and 1967. So they march because they can see. And another thing they do is fly kites. They fly incendiary kites. Again, not because it's romantic, but because there are no trees to impede. They fly incendiary balloons because there are no trees to impede. And so it's not only the case that the state acts and people take it, right? Resistance, the modes of resistance change in response to a changing landscape and a changing environment. And so what we found was that this border area, a high-risk area that was not used and that was feared, in this moment of the Great March of Return, and in a response to the slow violence that the land experienced, these became social spaces. They became places of prayer, of commerce, playgrounds, activities, cultural spaces, in a strip where space is very precious. And so the kinds of people who would attend it were from all over Gaza, from various classes. And I show you these images of the various people that I would run into who produced masks of their own to protect themselves from Israeli tear gas being fired through drones, and to enable themselves to participate in the march. Now, this is where we were in Gaza a week and a half ago. We had periodic wars, periodic bulldozing, and the spraying of herbicide, including things like random missiles being shot and the use of tear gas. Just in the past few days, what we're seeing is an acceleration of this damage, what we call human-made earthquakes in Gaza and human-made airquakes. So on Saturday, just of last week, the Israeli occupation forces bombed the largest pesticide storage facility in the north of Gaza, Beit Lahia. And this is the facility that was bombed. The smoke was seen for 3 hours. It was a huge cloud of toxic fumes from the north that were seen all the way to Jabalia refugee camp. And these toxic fumes were being inhaled by those who survived the missiles. So it's not that the missiles kill and that's the end of the story. The ones who survive have to breathe the air that is produced after a pesticide factory is bombed. And they were warned by the Ministry of Health to remain indoors and close their windows. By the evening, the fire spread so much that it was even seen from Gaza City. And it also, there were concerns that it would affect the water reserves in the north, which would obviously affect access to water for 500,000 people living in the north of Gaza. By the evening, this is the color smoke that was seen from Jabalia refugee camp. So these are all images that colleagues of mine and friends of mine, collaborators of mine are sending me. Then on Monday, the 17th, so 3 days ago, Israel bombed another chemical company, an economic center of Gaza, the Fumco sponge factory. So again, we had chemicals in the air from this sponge factory. And then on Tuesday, 2 days ago, the occupation forces bombed the polish and paint factory in the south. Today was yet another factory of chemicals, also for paint on the eastern part of Gaza. So what this produces are toxic smokes of what we call airquakes, right? So we have populations and on Earth, above them is the air that is toxic. And below them, you have what we call human-made earthquakes. So these are Israeli-made earthquakes. And the Israeli Ministry of Defense has been bragging in the past week of new kinds of missiles that they have that don't explode upon impact, but that go far deep into the roads, and then they explode from underneath. So they shatter, they produce a kind of liquid ripple effect that affects the foundations of all the buildings around them. And so images like this and like this, where you see it's almost like an earthquake that took place. It's not the shattering of concrete or a crater. It goes deep in and it explodes it from under the ground. And this is an area that's not earthquake prone. So the buildings are not built for earthquakes, but they're essentially experiencing hundreds and hundreds of earthquakes each day, because in the current operation that is going on now, Israel has made a concerted effort to bomb roads. This was in front of the UNRWA headquarters, which is again, something else that we see, where you have the concrete exploding in the form, almost like pieces of ice on a lake or a river. And so with images like this, these types of ripple effects that are created, we come to understand that what we are seeing are human-made, as I said, airquakes and earthquakes, between which a besieged population is living or trying to live. And on top of that slow violence that we had seen develop in Gaza. And I'm showing you this because this is telling us of the violence that is to come. Because when there is a ceasefire, as there may well be any minute now, what we will see is that random buildings in the center of Gaza will start to collapse, because a crack will eventually open up in the foundation of that building. And these random buildings, residential buildings, commercial buildings, will themselves start to collapse. So this is a long-term damage. And it is violence that is slow, that will happen over time and with gravity and with natural environmental energies. But once it collapses, it will be extremely fast, and the effect of which will be on people's bodies. So I'm going to stop here. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much for that, SHOURIDEH. We now have our final speaker, KATHRYN YUSOFF. Thank you very much. You're muted.
Sorry, I should know by now. We've been doing this all year. I was just saying thank you to SHOURIDEH for talking us through that, and it very much resonates with some things that I'm going to say. But also to the organisers, it's really fantastic set of talks and kind of conceptualisation of the ground, and really seems to be some super interesting things going on in architecture at the moment. So it's really nice to be having a conversation between geography and architecture as well. So I'm just going to start off with some kind of basic propositions, in a sense, around kind of colonialism now, and just thinking about some of these connections through the kind of provocation of broken grounds. And, you know, as Shuri's just been talking about, just to say that, you know, obviously colonialism is this ongoing process of breaking ground. So it's very much a kind of active force in the kind of continuance of neo-colonial and settler colonial forms. But one of the ways in which I really want us to kind of think about it is as a form of geotrauma. So by this, I mean that trauma is concerned with the geos. So where the geos becomes weaponized as a spatial and geophysical rupture in relation to places and spaces of freedom, and also in terms of the erasure of history and the kind of diminishment of futurity. So thinking about these kind of geotrauma as a material form that sustains the kind of bio and geos as kind of reciprocal implications that on which like life depends. But at the same time that we're sort of registering these acts of geotrauma, colonialism is always in this sort of initiating forms of kind of coverance, of producing maps that cover the ruptures in these territories. And these movements towards a kind of cartography of global world space conversely submerge and raise the brokenness and relocate these in new forms of kind of universalizing space. So we can think about kind of broken grounds are kind of by their very fragmentation and brokenness being made ready for incorporation. So brokenness is an anticipatory architecture rather than an endpoint or a point of ruination. So it's the beginning of an effective architecture of colonialism's ongoing project of racial capitalism and occupation. So breaking ground we can think of as kind of prologue. Broken grounds are a prequel to settler colonialism and its ongoing sedimentation. So this is a process of kind of continual erasures, but it's erasures organized through a kind of material telos that is about kind of new origin stories that rely on these erasures to kind of instigate the kind of planting of these origin stories. So we can think of kind of effectual architectures of geology and these kind of anticipatory geologics and grammars as a way to think about how subjects and places are transformed through material architectures that exceed the built environment, and how this materiality conditions forms of existence, such as embodiment, spatial politics, forms of racialized gravities. So, you know, in terms of, we've just been hearing about in terms of state violence. So this is the flesh of geology, to use Hortense Spiller's terminology, of life reduced to commodified flesh to which anything can be done. And we can see this as a kind of instigated through these kind of fractures or breaking of geotraumatic ground through which architectures of life and their infrastructures are produced. So my work has become really concerned with thinking about how foundationally race is inscribed in grammars of inhuman matter, and whether we think about material relations, so water, air, fuel, food, matter as resource, we're also talking about historic structures of racialization. So there is no kind of matter without these historic structures of racialization. And whereas kind of rocks often kind of be considered sort of impolitic until they come into infrastructures, there's a very kind of there's a syntax and a politics of enclosure in the kind of signifying extractive languages, or the kind of material syntax of colonialism that precedes this and is organized around the kind of hierarchical organization of bodies as not persons. So the kind of as kind of awaiting extractive matter. So I think, you know, we see this clearly recognized in things like Standing Rock, for example, of water is life. So that relation to matter has everything to do with the possibility of subjectivity, survival, and it's racialized from the get-go. So as Black and Native life were coded into orders of materiality as inhuman and subhuman, that erasure is based around an organizing logic of extraction. So of this kind of division between the bios and geos as the kind of color line of materiality. So this grammar of geology, I think, is foundationally racialized, and this has consequences for how we think about extraction and environmental change and the embodiment of those proximities to Black and brown bodies. So if we think here of settler colonialism, you know, as a structure and not event in the sort of formation of Patrick Wolfe, then the forms of racialization that produced indigenous genocide and enslavement and all their kind of complex migrational forms in colonial afterlives can be seen as part of the extractive infrastructure. So not outside of or kind of in service of, but actually the very sort of concomitant sort of effective architecture with those built forms. So this extraction was propertied, so it's about land and resource, but it's also about extracting properties, so value, labor, supremacy through subjection. So there's a kind of vertical relation, as we've just been seeing in terms of the underground bombing. There's racialized undergrounds being created through this process. So it's not just about the kind of sort of dominion over space, but it's about these relationships that percolate into the ground and push certain subjects deeper and closer into a proximity with the ground. So this geotrauma is both kind of noun and verb. It's ground and gravity, and particularly anti-black and brown gravities. So these modes of extraction happen through the grammars of geology in the codification of land and resource and people into racial hierarchies. And we can think here about how kind of blackness was literally placed in a different strata in time. So a stratum that was diagrammed to subtend white supremacy as the kind of formation of, or kind of pre-formation of white grounds. So this perspectivism was a political economy of who had a right to the present, materially and ideologically. But it's also a geographical strategy that that justified the right to take other people's geography. So justified and covered over the geotraumas of kind of extraction from place and from relation. So we can think about this as, in the way in which I've been thinking about it, as a kind of white supremacy of matter. And it's, you know, obviously as active today as it was during colonialism. And we only have to kind of look at the bodies who labor in the kind of risks of extraction and absorb the force of environmental disasters, whether these are kind of like weaponized, intentional, well, they're always intentional, but these kind of weaponized forms of white supremacy and colonialism. Is really to think about the grammar of matter as encoding and positioning bodies in relation to harm and possibility, exposure and toxicity, and to understand those as a kind of ongoing part of the materialities of race and how these are always being structured through the historical geographies of race. So if we think about race as a geologic force, it changes the way I think we can think about exposure of persons as bodies that are conceptualized as such, right? So we can think here about the term inundation, for example, as capturing something of the way in which black and brown bodies are imaged as an absorbent frontier in environments and their extraction and deformation. So that's to sort of say that black and brown bodies are never individuated in that process, worthy of being noticed, recognized and grieved, but they're enclosed and incarcerated as a buffer to extraction and to these kind of ongoing architectures of colonialism. So we can think perhaps of the mine as a kind of paradigmatic in a sense of geotrauma and the kind of way in which the mine migrates in all its different sort of forms, both conceptually and materially, as a kind of process of undergrounding, of racial undergrounding of particular bodies coded as such. So geology and its kin network of extraction, natural resources, architectures of geomorphic transformation, so dams, river straightening, climate change, and the kind of domestic kin of cement, sidewalks and real estate, as well as the redistribution of geologic materials, so kitchen sinks to nuclear bunkers to asphalt, and the transformation of geochemical energy, so carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, for example. They're all mobilized within a normative mode of materiality. And in this conversion of the earth, through these historic and colonial grammars of geology, the materializing of epistemic violence enacts this world building and world shattering that is characterized by these unequal accesses to geopower. So geopower becomes a kind of form and weaponization of the very kind of possibilities of accumulation from geologic materials, shade from a tree. And its inverse is exhaustion or exposure to extractive predation. So we can think here there's like two subject states that might be distinguished. Those given by extraction, so kind of white man's overburden, and those continuously exposed by extractive processes, such as that they are subject to the weight of the overburden. So this means that we can begin to think about a geophysics or a gravity, a racialized gravity that presses upon certain kind of bodies within environments, and presses a kind of closer intimacy to the kind of both the kind of violence of the earth, but also potentially in a more kind of a liberatory mode, a different kind of relationship outside of and in excess of that colonial relationship to land. So if we think about how geologic grammars stabilize extraction and the material object for the extraction of value and the creation of the commodity form, we can see this kind of psychic splitting of bios and geos, and its realization in these kind of material segregations of inhuman, non-human, and human matter, which kind of mitigate over the kind of the forms of extraction that geotrauma performs in a sense. So the mine is one archetype or industrial blueprint of those extractive relations, combining racial subjectivity with planetary dissolve. So if we consider the architectures of attribution and accumulation, the mine cannot be kind of isolated from what it builds on the surface. And this is this relationship between the surface and the underground, and, you know, the literal kind of, as we're seeing in Palestine, the little literal sort of undergrounding the undergrounds, you know, so the tunnels that are the kind of, you know, forms of resistance against that surface kind of pressure become themselves kind of taken further down into the underground. So one of the things that we might kind of think about in a counter reading of geology is just this kind of supplementary account of geology's effective architectures to restore the kind of geotraumas to the scene of extraction and to the scene of the surface. So in material terms, this means engaging both subjugation and the rifts in displacement. So unearthing the ground and upending its hierarchies through underground structures promises this kind of confrontation with the domination of white surfaces and their oppressive gravities, where the earth is understood as a kind of effective disposition mobilized against the propertied relation and its sort of predation. And what this kind of, I mean, what this might mean in terms of architectures is thinking about how architectures reveal a dialogue with the grounds, with the kind of brokenness that is built over, and what the effective relays are between those architectures and a kind of geoethics in racial, you know, conceived for racialized times, to think about the kind of reconstituting the geotrauma that allows the surface its kind of plasticity in a sense. So I think I'll leave that there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So I'd like to thank everyone for those 4 really fantastic papers. My mind is absolutely kind of buzzing with ideas and questions and connecting threads between them. I think the presentations spoke so powerfully to one another, and which is really testimony to the importance of the work that all of you are doing, and also to the curation of this conversation by Allison and Arusiak. So I do realize that that time is short, and I had a number of different questions prepared, but in a sense, there's one that I feel is maybe feeling like it's the most pressing for me right now, and that really maybe focuses on the bodies that all of you are addressing in different ways. And then there are a lot of connections, so that there are the farmers that DVERA's work and SHOURIDEH's work addresses, and then the miners in CARA and KATHRYN. So there are also the kind of types of work that are also similar between your papers. And I mean, you know, it just, you're telling such important stories of people whose lives, whose livelihoods have been decimated by these various kinds of oppressive operations within this thick surface of unequal power relations. And I know, Shouride, you address this question most specifically by talking about not these sites, not simply as kind of places where things are being done to people, but also as sites of resistance. And so I was just hoping that that you could talk about, let's say, the possibility also then of you know, of kind of resisting against some of these forces and looking at the potential also of the kind of brokenness of these grounds. I mean, as KATHRYN says, that there's the brokenness of the ground is the kind of starting point, right, for this future, but also then where we are here of what kind of starting point could we be looking at in a future, which is more, let's say, you know, thinking about different kinds of rewriting those power relations, perhaps.
Yeah, sorry, were you wanted me to go first? Maybe
I don't mind, but go ahead.
Sorry. No, I mean, so I'm speaking mainly in the context of Palestine. Yeah, it's the small part of the world that I know well. I know nothing of anything else. What, in terms of how people resist, well, I mean, there's just too many examples to give in the present moment. But what we see is that, especially when you're talking about people who have lived through multiple traumas, right, in one lifetime, multiple traumas, and traumas that have been inherited through stories. So when you're 5 years old, you know about displacement, you know refugees, or you are one statistically in Palestine. Resilience and creativity is something that comes almost inherent to you. So something that we would praise in other societies is very common in a place like Palestine. And so you have very little examples where, you know, people work overnight during air raids in Gaza, as they did 2 days ago, to rebuild one of those roads. So the UNRWA road in front of it was rebuilt the next day by the Gaza municipality because they realized this is a main road that leads to the hospital. We need this road, and we know they're going to keep bombing us, right? So there is that form. But I think the more interesting ones are the ones where you realize how communal relations play out. So what you don't have in Gaza are nuclear families, right, that are isolated in this sort of individualized existence. When one building is given warnings, families leave and they're taken in by other families and they become reshuffled. And when that is, they become reshuffled. And whereas in the past, you would have the rural areas of, not the city centers, not the commercial centers bombed in the previous wars. And you would have then farmers going into the cities for protection because Israel was bombing the borders, so-called, and flattening them. Now it's the reverse. The city is the unsafe place, Gaza City in particular, its commercial areas. Because what we're seeing that is being bombed are not just factories and malls, but banks, ministries of interior that deal with paperwork, schools. The library in front of the Islamic University was bombed 2 days ago. So if anybody's questioning why we boycott Israeli academia, well, it's because they keep bombing Palestinian libraries. So what happened is that the city population that was already families mixed with other families, so these relations, is now leaving the city, right? They're leaving the city, they're going to the rural areas. And that creates a complete shift in how people relate and organize and seek protection. So the border areas that were the most unsafe part of Gaza are now the areas that people feel more safe because they're not the buildings that are getting warnings. So in these ways, I mean, you realize how malleable, how flexible, and how quick thinking people are. And in this moment of uprising across historic Palestine, there is this spirit of camaraderie that goes beyond class and beyond political affiliation. And now, I mean, if the city's smashed, then thinkers and scholars and artists in Gaza City are going to move to the rural areas, right? What we're gonna see is a shift in where knowledge is produced from in the strip.
Thank you. DVERA?
Could you repeat the question again?
So I was, I think it was really trying to think about the ways that some of the papers could find some kind of common ground as well, and really to, you know, I think that your paper and also SHOURIDEH's paper, you know, you're really and CARA's work too, that you're talking to, you know, the people who are on the ground, who are living this experience, that their voices become part of the narrative work. And so I was hoping that you might talk a bit more about the potential of kind of resistance to some of these, you know, I mean, there is this thing of not being able to move away from the pesticides, of course, but is there, you know, are there any grounds for resistance as well in this situation?
I think what we've seen now amidst the pandemic has where farm workers are now called essential workers, even though that is kind of a mixed bag, because while it's politicized and gained attention to a people who have been kind of ignored and marginalized for many decades, it's also a way of justifying certain labor hierarchies and regimes, that we just expect certain people to do certain things for us so that we have food to eat. So I think what struck me about SHOURIDEH's presentation was the murals, and thinking about how people around here memorialize their history and their life experiences through art on the walls in all the little communities in the San Joaquin Valley, and the parallels too with the representations of people and agriculture as two forms of life, I think are one form of resistance that has a long history here, and that some of my friends and colleagues who are artists are active participants in. And I think it would be neat to extend that conversation. Another form of resistance that I didn't get to touch on much was the memorials that people create to remember people who have passed in agriculture, and spaces to pray for them as well. So the one image was of the altar at Pinto Lake, which is by this. It's sort of a shrine farm workers have made that was next to this tree that was actually cut down, which had an image of the Virgin Mary in it, an apparition. And then there's also a lot of, I think, there's been long-term resistance against pesticides. So I think more and more we have to ask ourselves, is the use of these chemicals inevitable? Is that really what feeds the world, or are people feeding the world? And connecting to CARA's work too, I think asking questions about the inevitability of disposable labor in all of these places is we're at a good point for that. And I think the pandemic has opened up more spaces for that. And we can't let them shut down as everything else is reopening and going back to normal.
Thank you. CARA, did you want to comment on that, or one of the other connections?
Yeah, there's so much overlap that I see here. Even just the forensic look that SHOURIDEH you did with wind. It's such it's just one example of this invisible violence that's perpetrated in a very slow way. And people are conscious of it. Somebody is consciously doing these things. I mean, when they were testing at the Nevada test site, if the wind was blowing toward Las Vegas, they didn't test. If it was blowing towards Utah, they did test. And I think to what DVERA said also about bearing witness to the experiences of people on the ground, you know, I feel like my role as an artist, it like sometimes feels like it's not enough, but it is my platform. I've always been sort of like, there just hasn't been like another path that's emerged that's made sense to me to do anything else. So I do feel some kind of obligation to be a conduit. You know, the stories that I collected for the record, were incredible. The people that I got to speak with, you know, I only put a couple minutes from each on the record, but it was enormously important. Growing up with some of my mom's stories from a little bit removed perspective, her telling me about her friends and stuff, all of it informs what I'm doing. And I didn't mean to use those as like my CARA DESPAIN artwork. I meant to use myself as a conduit to elevate those histories. And I feel like that's the best I can do. And sometimes I get a bit nervous if I'm over aestheticizing something, or if I'm making something that feels too beautiful. But I also very much realize that that's the power and the tool that I have to trick people in, to trick people to come in and sit down, and then I hit them with the conversation. And it's interesting to see how each of you do that, you know, in your own ways and in your own areas of research. And yeah, there's just so many connections. It's nice. Sometimes I feel also like I'm hyper focused and hyper real. But I think there's always a correlation. And so it's nice to hear each of you speak about your specialized zone of focus, because the more we connect those dots between places, the more we can kind of understand that these things are related, are happening to all of us in different measure, of course. Yeah, if that makes sense.
Well, I mean, I think it's so interesting the way also the way all of you are using visual images. And so exactly, Kara, what you were saying, that, you know, we have a geographer and an anthropologist and an artist, and SHOURIDEH, you're a political scientist, but also involved in architecture, and many, I mean, all of you are interdisciplinary yourselves. And then this conversation becomes very much so. And KATHRYN, I'm just, you know, very struck by also the way in which you really are engaged with art practice and art making. So, you know, not just obviously cartography, but also more contemporary art pieces in your work. And I'm just wondering maybe if you could talk a little bit methodologically about how you see that working, like Kara's coming from the artistic perspective, but talking about land, and you're coming from the geographical perspective, and also then using artworks.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think kind of, I mean, one of the things that is sort of connected, I think, in all our talks, or our kind of thinking, is about this kind of question of bearing witness and what it means to sort of resurrect these geologic ghosts. Like, I like that term from Edouard Glissant. And, you know, he talks about sort of rebuilding subjectivity from the kind of fluvial kind of disappearance and erasures of colonialism, and thinking about sort of bearing witness always has to be in a grammar that's different to those kind of colonial grammars, right? So that's where kind of, you know, poetry for the sort of post-colonial writers became really, you know, a kind of absolutely part of the geopolitical armory, in a sense, and sort of, so, you know, and just thinking about the sort of, you know, the DVERA and SHOURIDEH were both talking about kind of voice, and how sonic resistance becomes a way to rebuild a kind of effective architecture. The building may be gone, but if the kind of voices and stories are sort of bringing together to sort of bring that back into being, then there's a different kind of sort of geophysics in place. So that's kind of, you know, some of the connections I see, and thinking about creative practice as a way to intervene in re-languaging those spaces, and whether that's through kind of murals or kind of roadside kind of memorials, or through kind of sound. You know, we think about all the sort of, you know, I was talking about racialized undergrounds, but all the sort of creative undergrounds, the Underground Railroad, kind of jazz, you know, all these kind of ways in which sort of that pressure kind of also kind of has a counter pressure, and those kind of racialized gravities also, you know, have a kind of but I think that for me, methodologically, trying to think about other languages in which to build those ghosts of geology are part of the story. Because you don't always have the living voice, in a sense, that, and you know, that's part of what erasure does, is actually it's like erases those voices and bodies and places. So
Okay, hello. I'm so sorry to jump in because I feel like we've just gotten started, but I want to respect SHOURIDEH and KATHRYN, both. It's late where they are and they're tuning in from abroad. So I cannot thank the panelists and the moderator enough for this really sort of profound group of presentations. I think that we all have so many questions that we want to continue, but I think that's actually sort of a good segue to mention that this is our culminating conversation in the formal sense, but we're actually, just getting started. And we feel so incredibly grateful and privileged to have interacted with all 5 of you and the expanded team, sort of ground family. That's a little cliche, the ground team. Team didn't seem right either. But so we are actually, just getting started in terms of creating these constellations, and we are hoping to create a life beyond just the sort of archive of talks. And so part of that afterlife, or that ongoing life, is actually a call for submissions to an exhibition. And this is just going to be flashed in front of you for those of you who are still here, and thank you for your stamina. But this will be on the website, and the hope is to have both the artists and designers that have been involved in the series already, as well as others who are exploring questions around the various different grounds that we've been unpacking, as well as expanded grounds. So inviting sort of cross-media pieces to both live in an online platform and then hopefully curated into a physicalized exhibition. And ultimately we'll be putting this together as a book. So, there's sort of multiple manifestations of this. Again, thank you so much. This has really been great. I know that there were a number of questions. I think a few of my students actually emailed me questions or chatted me questions. So if I have the chance, I'll pass them along to the appropriate people. And again, thank you for being here. If the panelists don't mind just staying on for a minute, SHOURIDEH, I know that you can slip out. I just wanted to say an extra thank you.